Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 2. This is your vocabulary review video for your first set of vocabulary in Chapter 2. Before I pop over to Quizlet, I just thought I'd, kind of go through your chapter a little bit with you. You can see that the name of the chapter is Crime and Its Consequences. And the first page in the chapter, it has your objectives, but it has over here your chapter outline. This is helpful for when you take your chapter test, because you can just refer back here to how it's broken down by major topics and then subtopics to find answers to questions on your test. So your outline, the first major topic in this chapter is the definition of crime. And you can see that there's a few different ones. There's a social definition, a legal definition, elements of crime, and then degrees or categories of crime. And then our next major topic is measurement of crime, crime statistics, crime rates, the uniform crime reports, and there's several other reporting agencies and documents that talk about statistics. And then you have the cost of crime, you have fear of crime, victims of crime. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right now, this chapter is going to be full of numbers, statistics, and percentages, and money amounts, okay? Do not get overwhelmed with all of that. It is not, you're never going to remember or memorize every single statistic that they talk about. In fact, you're not expected to memorize anything in the textbook. You're just supposed to, read it, comprehend it, be able to find a piece of information to go back later because you've already read it, you've already comprehended it. Your vocabulary, of course, is very important, but I don't want you to get bogged down in trying to memorize every single fact and figure and statistic, because there's millions of them in the entire textbook and probably even in this chapter alone. So, just kind of try to put a visual in your mind as you read about a statistic and try to visualize what that looks like and how many people or how many crimes that is, but don't focus on, the actual number. Okay, so you don't have very many pages this week, which is awesome. You have five pages. You still have 10 words. Your first 10 words are going to happen in the first 5 pages of your reading. So you're starting here on page 23, which is just your cover page here. And then we always have a crime story, and that's super interesting to read about because these are all true cases that have happened. And then we're going to get into the actual content here. And as always, your vocabulary is in blue out to the side. It's either out to the right or out to the left. So your first term is norm or social more. And then you have legal definition of crime. And then you have overcriminalization. And again, look at your pictures. Look at the captions under the pictures. Look at graphs. Look at charts as you're reading. On this page, we have non-enforcement, undercriminalization. Then they get into elements of crime. And you have a bunch of words here on page 27, harm, legality, ex post facto law, actus reus. And then your last word actually is at the very top here of page 28, mens rea. Mens rea, and you see it in green right here where they talk about it. So for your reading, you should at least finish to this point on page 28. If you want to keep going and finish page 28, that's up to you. But these other words will be on next week's quiz. Okay, so mens rea is your last word. So if I haven't mentioned to you already, I'll do it now. A lot of the words in criminal justice are Latin, and that's what mens rea is. It's Latin. And actus reus here, that's Latin. Ex post facto, Latin. And there's a whole bunch of others. So it's just that's part of our field, and we'll just have to memorize what that term is and what it means. So I'm going to pop over to Quizlet, and the link has already been shared with you in Google Classroom and on the lesson plan. But you're looking at Chapter 2, first set. All right. So let me move me back up here. Your first word is norm. Norm is any standard or rule regarding what human beings should or should not think, say, or do under given circumstances. So why are we talking about that word in criminal justice or in this chapter? Well, because when we start talking about crimes and laws and who decided these laws needed to be laws, well, it's in theory, it's the people, society. We elect politicians, we elect legislators to our government. The legislative branch of government is who writes and passes laws. And those people are elected by the majority. Okay, and in theory, they represent what the majority wants. But the thing about society is that it changes over time. And I'm sure you've all seen movies that are, or TV shows that are in a different time period, right? Like we're in 2020 right now, or, the 2000s. I don't know how much you know about the 1950s, but the 1950s were very different as society. What was normal in 1950 is not necessarily considered normal today. And certainly things that we have today would not be normal in 1950. And going back even further, think about the 1800s. I mean, in the 1800s and even earlier than that, women were not allowed to wear dresses that did not reach their shoes. They were not allowed to show their ankles, much less any part of their leg. Well, just think about that today. And what do we wear? What's normal clothing today? And that's just a simple example, but when you start to think about it. So that's why your word norm is in here as a starting point, a jumping off point to discuss, well, how did these laws come about, and why do we have why do we have these and not those? And it all has to do with what is normal at the time of a given society. Okay. So your next term is legal definition of crime. And the definition is it's an intentional violation of the criminal law or penal code committed without defense or excuse and penalized by the state. So there's lots of acts, lots of things people do that you might think, or I might think, that ought to be illegal. There should be a law against that. If there isn't, and it has to, the laws that we do have has to be specifically explained and identified, and there has to be a punishment, and you can't have a legal excuse for why you did it, and you have to have done it intentionally, then it is a crime, and that is the legal definition of crime. Otherwise, it's not a crime. So, our next term is over-criminalization. Over is kind of what it sounds like. It's the prohibition by the criminal law of some behaviors that arguably should not be prohibited. So we're making too many things criminal that we shouldn't. And I'm sure everybody, if they took a minute to think about it, they could come up with some examples of things that they believe, that you believe, or maybe even I believe, that are currently illegal, but we don't think that they should be. That is what over-criminalization is. And this is a better topic for in-person discussion about, what are those things? What are some of the areas that you think should not be criminalized, and why? And what will it take to decriminalize that particular act? Okay. Our next term is non-enforcement. And non-enforcement is the failure to routinely enforce prohibitions against certain behaviors. So it's a law that's on the books. Like, technically, somebody could be charged for doing this crime, but law enforcement and there's a few different reasons why this occurs, non-enforcement, they just don't make arrests for it. Okay. And again, this is a better for a group discussion, but I can tell you this is an actual example. And I think your book has a whole list of these. So there's actually still a whole bunch of laws on the books that are really, really, really old. They're not even applicable anymore to today's society. They're laws from like the 1800s. And for whatever reason, the legislature just left them there and didn't go through the process of removing them. So they're still technically on the books. And I'd have to look it up to see the wording exactly, but I think one of the laws, and who knows why this came about, but it was illegal to give your horse an ice cream cone. I don't know. I have no idea why or how that came about, but it was illegal. Or no. I'm getting too mixed up. It's illegal to put an ice cream cone in your pocket. I think that was it. Who does that? First of all, who does that? Second of all, we're not going to arrest somebody for doing that. Why? But I mean, there was a reason. I would love to know what it is. But there was a reason that was originally put on the books. But obviously today, nobody enforces that. So that's non-enforcement. Under criminalization, so this is the opposite of over-criminalization. Under criminalization is the failure to prohibit behaviors that arguably should be prohibited. So again, if you took a minute, I bet you could think about some things that you think, behaviors that people do that you think they shouldn't do, and that maybe it should even be criminal, but it's not. So that's I'll probably put that on a question on Google Classroom, and everybody can type their answers in. That'll be interesting to take a look at. So your next couple of words here, harm and legality, are basically talking about characteristics of acts and crimes. So when the legislature decides we need to write a new law against this behavior because this behavior is becoming a big problem, and even though, every time we write a law, we're taking a little bit of, I would say, freedom away from people, right? Because we're restricting what they can and cannot do. And the idea is that we have the least amount of laws and the least amount of restrictions that we can, while still maintaining a safe and civilized society for the majority. You're never going to make 100% of the people happy. So, legislators are supposed to think about the greater good. We're going to write a law. There's going to be some people not happy because we're telling them what they can and cannot do, but we believe more people will be protected than the few that are unhappy about it. So the first word, harm, is the external consequence that is required to make an action a crime. So there has to be a hurt. Somebody somewhere has to be hurt by the action in order for it to be a crime. It can't be a crime if nobody got hurt. And you'll hear people talk about victimless crimes, but so far, every single crime we do have on the books today, there is a harm to somebody somewhere, even if it's society in general. Okay? And I always use, I'll just use, I have several examples, but this is just better for an in-person conversation. So I'm just, this is a good review of your words and try to help you do well on your quiz. So that's the first consideration. An act has to have a harm in order for it to be considered a crime. Your next word is legality, and that is that the requirement that a harm must be legally forbidden for the behavior to be a crime, and that the law must not be retroactive. So that means if it wasn't a law when it happened, then it wasn't a crime. And even if we change the law and we make it a crime, we can't go back to the people who did it before and charge them. It's, when that law gets passed, moving forward. But anything prior to that, it's not a crime. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't on the books. So that's what legality is. And your next term, and it kind of goes in with that legality, is ex post facto. And what I always like to say with the Latin is very often you can see the English in it. So you can see fact and ex after the fact is basically the translation after the fact. Ex post facto law is a law that declares criminal an act that was not illegal when it was committed, increases the punishment for a crime after it was committed, or alters the rules of evidence in a particular case after the crime is committed. And you can't do any of those things. So these, basically this is telling you what you can't do. And I just kind of explained all that with legality. You can't go after the fact and change the rules and change the punishment and declare something criminal to the people before it was actually written as a new law. That's after the fact, and you're not allowed to do that. Okay? That's procedural law, and it's against the law. So our last two words are Latin again, and these two words are really, really important. The first one is actus reus. Actus reus, and what word do you see in it? Act. Well, the definition is the criminal conduct, specifically intentional or criminally negligent action or inaction that causes harm. So this is basically what you physically did. Mens rea, and you can see men, but mental, think mental, is the criminal intent, a guilty state of mind. So most crimes in their definition, not all, but most, requires a guilty act and a guilty mind. You have to have both. Bad thoughts alone are not enough to be considered criminal if you don't act on it, if you don't do anything about your bad thoughts. Think about it. Holy cow. Would you want to be held criminally responsible for every bad thought you've ever had? None of us would, right? We've all gotten angry. We've all gotten upset. Maybe at friends, brothers, sisters, parents, teachers, bosses, employers, right? We've all gotten upset and maybe we've thought a really bad thing, but we didn't do anything about it. That is not criminal. We had mens rea, we had a guilty mind, but we didn't have a guilty act to go with it. Conversely, sometimes we do things that technically are on the books, right, as being an illegal act, but we didn't have any guilty mind to go with it. What would we call that? What do you call something that you do, but you didn't mean to? You had no mind to do it. Most of the time we call that an accident, right? Accidents in general are not criminal because it's an accident, because you didn't mean for it to happen. You didn't have the criminal intent. But there are caveats. That means exceptions. Sometimes you could be guilty of being negligent or reckless. You didn't really intend for somebody. I'll give you an example. You think it's going to be funny to trip your friend. You don't intend to hurt them. You just want to make a joke and make everybody laugh. You do the physical act, the actus reus, the guilty act of tripping them. But when you tripped them, they smashed their head off the pavement and they got really hurt. You're still going to be guilty of something, probably recklessness, but not the higher crime. You have some guilty mind, but not major guilty mind. Okay? We'll talk more about this in class together, but these two terms are really important, and I need you to memorize those terms: actus reus, mens rea, guilty act, guilty mind. Most crimes require both things together, and I can give you tons of examples. So that's it. That's your vocabulary review for Chapter 2, first set.